Somewhere beneath the snow of the Sierra Nevada, there is a stump. Just a stump, weathered by more than a century and a half of mountain winters. But look closer, and something about it doesn't add up. The cut is nearly 10 feet off the ground. No man stands that tall. No axe swings that high. Unless, of course, the ground beneath the axeman wasn't the ground at all. Unless he was standing on snow so deep it had swallowed the world beneath it, standing on top of a forest that no longer looked like a forest, hacking at a tree trunk from a platform of frozen white that had buried an entire winter's worth of horror. That stump is still there today. And it is only the beginning of a story that includes some of the most harrowing tests of human endurance ever recorded on American soil. Snow that fell so fast it buried children between their schoolhouse and their front door. Cold so sudden it dropped the temperature nearly 100 degrees in a single day. Storms that swallowed the largest city in the nation and left bodies stacked in snowbanks on Broadway. This is the story of what happens when winter stops being a season and becomes something closer to a verdict. And it starts with 87 people, 23 wagons, and a shortcut that was never really there at all. In the spring of 1846, a wave of American families packed their belongings into ox-drawn wagons and set out from Independence, Missouri, chasing the promise of California. It was supposed to be a 4 to 6 month journey. Among them was a wealthy 60-year-old farmer named George Donner, his wife Tamsin, and a businessman named James Reed, along with their extended families and a collection of others who joined along the way. They called themselves, without a hint of irony at the time, a party. What they didn't know was that this word would eventually become synonymous with one of the darkest chapters in American history. The group made a fatal decision. Rather than follow the well-worn Oregon Trail route that thousands of pioneers had already tested, they gambled on something called the Hastings Cutoff, a supposed shortcut promoted by a guide named Lansford Hastings who had never actually led a wagon train through it himself. He had only ridden it on horseback. The cutoff turned out to be roughly 125 miles longer than the established trail, and it dragged the wagons through some of the most punishing terrain in the American West, including a waterless stretch of the Great Salt Lake Desert that nearly broke the group before winter had even arrived. Oxen died. Wagons were abandoned. Precious weeks bled away. By the time the emigrants reached the base of the Sierra Nevada, it was already late October, dangerously late for a mountain crossing, and they still had one of the hardest passages of the entire journey ahead of them. Then, on October 20th, an early and brutal snowstorm slammed into the mountains, months ahead of what anyone expected. It dumped foot after foot of dense, cement-like snow across the pass the emigrants desperately needed to cross. 81 people, more than half of them children, found themselves trapped. Just like that, the mountains sealed shut behind them like a door slamming closed, and there would be no reopening it until spring. What followed was nearly 5 months of a slow, grinding descent into starvation. The families built makeshift cabins near a lake that would later bear the Donner name, using them to shelter through what became one of the coldest and snowiest winters the region had ever recorded. They ate their oxen first. Then their horses. Then their dogs. When the meat was gone, they boiled the leather off their own boots and saddles and ate that too, choking down strips of hide just to feel something in their stomachs. Some ate the bark off trees. Children grew too weak to stand. And still the snow kept falling, burying the cabins so deep that smoke from the chimneys appeared to rise directly out of the ground. By mid-December, a group of the strongest members, 15 men and women, strapped together crude snowshoes out of oxhide and wagon parts and set out on foot to find help. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope, and the name would prove tragically accurate. Trapped by more storms, wandering without a clear route, they began to starve even faster than those they had left behind. And here the story crosses into the darkest territory imaginable. Faced with annihilation, the survivors debated drawing lots to determine who would be sacrificed to feed the others. Before they had to go through with it, several members died naturally from exhaustion and exposure, and the ones still breathing made the unbearable choice to eat the flesh of their fallen companions in order to survive. Only a handful of the original 15 made it out alive. More than a month later, staggering into a Native American village on the western slope of the mountains, barely recognizable as human. Word reached California, and rescue parties began the dangerous climb back into the mountains to find the families left behind. The first relief team didn't reach the survivors until February 19, 1847, nearly 4 months after the group had first become trapped. But rescue, it turned out, was not the end of the ordeal. The deep snow made it impossible for pack animals to reach the camps, so rescuers could only carry in what little food they could shoulder themselves, and they could only lead out the survivors strong enough to walk. 4 separate relief expeditions, spread out over more than 2 months, were required to bring everyone down from the mountains. Many of those who had survived the worst of the winter died anyway, too weakened to make the journey out. And back at the camps, among those too sick or too proud to leave, the last stages of the tragedy played out in scenes almost too grim to describe. When the final rescue team arrived in April, they found only one person still alive at the lake camp, a German immigrant named Louis Kiesberg, surrounded by human remains, having survived the final weeks entirely on the bodies of the dead. He would spend the rest of his life fending off accusations that some of those deaths had not been natural at all, accusations that were never proven and haunted him until he died. Of the roughly 87 people who set out on that shortcut, 42 never made it out of the mountains alive. 45 did, including numerous children who went on to live long lives, carrying with them memories that most of them would never fully speak about. The Donner Party's ordeal became a national sensation almost immediately, splashed across newspapers with a mixture of horror and fascination that has never really faded. But for all the grim mythology that surrounds it, the true story is less about monstrous appetite and more about how far ordinary people will go, and what unimaginable choices they will make, simply to see another sunrise. It remains, to this day, one of the starkest warnings in American history about what winter can do to those who underestimate it. 41 years later, and more than 1,000 miles to the east, winter would deliver a different kind of horror, one that struck not over the slow agony of months, but in the space of a single afternoon. January 12, 1888, began deceptively, almost mockingly gentle. Across the Dakota Territory, Nebraska, and Minnesota, the morning arrived unusually mild after weeks of brutal cold. In some towns, temperatures climbed into the 40s, even close to 50 degrees. Farmers stepped outside without their heavy coats. Children who had been kept home during the previous week's frigid weather begged their parents to let them go back to school, and many parents, relieved by the sudden warmth, said yes. It felt, to many families across the prairie, like the worst of winter had finally broken. The storm caught the region at the worst possible moment, right as schoolchildren across hundreds of rural communities were preparing to walk home. Many teachers, alone in isolated one-room schoolhouses with a handful of young students and dwindling firewood, were forced into a life-or-death decision in a matter of seconds. Do you keep the children inside the schoolhouse and hope the fuel holds out through the night? Or do you try to lead them through the storm to the nearest farmhouse before the light disappears completely? Some of those choices became legend. A young teacher named Minnie Freeman, working in Mira Valley, Nebraska, found herself trapped when the wind ripped the roof clean off her schoolhouse. With no shelter left and the storm raging around her, she gathered her students, tied them together so no child could be lost in the whiteout, and led them safely through the blizzard to a nearby home. She would later be celebrated across the country as a hero, her story even turned into a popular song. In South Dakota, 2 men strung a rope from a schoolhouse to the nearest shelter so that a line of children could be guided hand over hand through the blinding snow without losing their way. In Pawnee City, Nebraska, a teacher named Seymour Dopp made the opposite choice, keeping his 17 students inside overnight and burning through their stockpiled wood to keep them alive until parents could dig through 5-foot snowdrifts to reach them the next morning. His caution likely saved every single one of their lives. But not every story ended that way. In one especially devastating account, a teacher named Lois Royce realized there wasn't enough fuel left to survive the night inside her schoolhouse. Believing a nearby shelter was close enough to reach, she led 3 of her students out into the open. It was less than 100 yards away. In the whiteout conditions, she lost her way. Unable to find the shelter, she and her 3 students were caught in the open as the temperature kept collapsing. Royce survived, but lost her feet to frostbite. Her 3 young students did not survive the night at all, freezing to death in her arms in a field within shouting distance of safety they never found. Story after story like it emerged from across the plains in the days that followed. A 10-year-old boy named Johnny Walsh froze to death trying to find his own house. 6 siblings from a single family died together trying to make it home from the same rural schoolhouse. Fathers who went out looking for lost sons were themselves found frozen the next morning, sometimes only yards from their own front doors. When the storm finally passed and rescue parties fanned out across the frozen prairie, the scale of the tragedy became clear. Death toll estimates for what came to be known as the school children's blizzard, or the children's blizzard, range from roughly 200 to as many as 500 people, with the most commonly cited figure landing around 235. A disproportionate number of the dead were children, caught between the false comfort of a warm morning and the merciless deception of a storm that gave almost no warning at all. The tragedy prompted lasting changes to how the country forecasted and communicated severe weather, a grim but necessary legacy carved out of one of the deadliest single-day disasters in American history. And it happened, almost unbelievably, less than 2 months before an entirely different kind of winter catastrophe would strike thousands of miles away, in the beating heart of the nation's largest city. By March of 1888, the country had already endured what felt like its worst winter in memory. Then came March 11th. New Yorkers woke that Sunday to temperatures in the mid-50s, spring practically in the air. Nobody, from ordinary commuters to the federal government's own weather forecasters, saw any reason for alarm. The official forecast for the coming days called for nothing more than brisk winds and rain followed by fair weather. It could not have been more wrong. As a cold front from the west collided violently with a warm, moisture-laden system moving up from the south, the temperature began a dramatic freefall through Sunday night. Rain turned to snow. Winds that had been merely brisk began to howl, eventually gusting past 80 miles an hour, hurricane-force winds slamming into a city with buildings and infrastructure never designed to withstand anything like it. By Monday morning, 10 inches of snow already blanketed the streets of Manhattan. And the storm was nowhere near finished. Because much of the city's infrastructure, telegraph wires, telephone lines, and even electrical cables, ran overhead rather than underground, the ferocious winds tore them down one after another, leaving the nation's largest city functionally cut off from the rest of the world. Elevated train lines, the primary way New Yorkers moved through the city, froze solid or became so buried in snowdrifts that trains simply stopped where they stood. As many as 15,000 passengers found themselves stranded aboard stuck elevated cars, some for the better part of a full day, with resourceful bystanders occasionally showing up with ladders to help people climb down for a fee. Streets vanished beneath snowdrifts that in some places reached the second story of buildings, drifts as high as 50 feet were reported in certain areas, and people wandered blindly through what had, only a day earlier, been familiar city blocks. The storm did not relent until March 14th, having buried the city under nearly 2 feet of snow in Manhattan itself, and considerably more just outside it, with towns north of the city recording totals as staggering as 58 inches. In New York alone, roughly 200 people died, many of them found buried in snowdrifts along sidewalks where they had simply lost their way and succumbed to the cold. Among the dead was Roscoe Conkling, a former United States Senator and one of the most powerful political figures in the country, who had insisted on walking home through the storm rather than wait it out and collapsed from exposure and exhaustion before ever reaching his destination. Along the eastern seaboard beyond the city, the storm's hurricane-force winds wrecked ships up and down the coastline, drowning roughly 100 sailors in addition to the hundreds who died on land. All told, more than 400 people lost their lives across the region in what came to be remembered as the Great Blizzard of 1888, or the Great White Hurricane. The cleanup that followed was almost as staggering as the storm itself. With no snowplows built to handle a disaster of this magnitude, the city was forced to remove an estimated 24 million cubic yards of snow largely by hand, a process that took days and left the streets an obstacle course of shattered glass, frozen debris, and the wreckage of a transportation system brought completely to its knees. But out of the disaster came real change. The storm exposed just how fragile a modern city could be when its lifelines all ran along the surface, and in its aftermath New York began the long process of burying its telegraph and power lines underground and constructing an entirely new form of transportation to survive future storms, the underground subway system that would eventually come to define the city itself. It is a strange and sobering thought that some of the infrastructure New Yorkers rely on every single day exists, in part, because of 3 days in March when nature reminded an entire metropolis exactly how small it really was. More than half a century later, winter would once again catch an entire region off guard, this time not with snow burying a city, but with a storm that turned a perfect autumn day into one of the deadliest hunting tragedies in American history. November 11, 1940, was Armistice Day, a national holiday commemorating the end of the First World War, and across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa, thousands of duck hunters took the day off to head out onto the Mississippi River and its surrounding marshes. The morning could not have felt more inviting. Temperatures hovered in the mid-50s. Skies were mild. Hunters, many of them dressed in light jackets rather than heavy winter gear, waded into the sloughs and backwaters expecting nothing more than a pleasant day chasing waterfowl. And the ducks, as it turned out, seemed to know something the hunters didn't. Witnesses would later describe extraordinary numbers of mallards and canvasbacks pouring into the marshes that morning, flying with an almost frantic urgency, as if fleeing something the men below them could not yet see. It was, by many accounts, the best hunting day anyone could remember, right up until it became one of the worst days of their lives. Far to the west, a storm system that had already battered the Pacific Northwest with near hurricane-force winds was barreling across the country, and rather than weakening as it crossed the Rocky Mountains the way most storms did, this one drew in enormous amounts of moisture from the Gulf of Mexico and collided head-on with a mass of frigid Canadian air. The result was an explosive, almost unnatural intensification, a storm system behaving less like a typical winter weather pattern and more like a hurricane born 900 miles from the nearest ocean. Around midday, the sky began to darken. Drizzle turned to light snow, and then, within the span of minutes, the wind shifted violently out of the northwest and the temperature began collapsing, in some places falling by as much as 40 degrees within 24 hours. Snowfall rates reached an astonishing 3 to 4 inches per hour. The calm waters the hunters had been sitting in transformed into a churning, wind-whipped chaos, with waves reported as high as 5 feet slamming into small hunting skiffs never designed for anything close to those conditions. Hunters scattered across small islands and marshy points found themselves suddenly and completely stranded, with no way back to shore and no shelter beyond overturned boats that offered almost no protection against gale-force winds. Wooden decoys, the tools of their trade only hours earlier, were broken apart and burned for warmth as the temperature plunged towards zero and below. Among those caught in the chaos was a teenager named Bud Grant, who decades later would become a legendary head coach of the Minnesota Vikings. As a young man barely into his teens, Grant fought through the rising water and violent wind alongside a hunting partner, their small boat pitching wildly until it was finally thrown against the shore. Forced to abandon it, the two waded through swampy, waist-deep water in a desperate attempt to reach a distant cabin, one of countless similar struggles for survival unfolding simultaneously across the river that night. Grant made it. Many others did not. As night fell and temperatures continued their brutal descent, hunters who had been separated from any real shelter faced the agonizing test of endurance against cold their light autumn clothing was never built to withstand. Some drowned trying to swim or wade to shore through icy, wind-churned water. Others froze to death directly on the small islands where they had taken refuge, huddled beneath capsized boats as the temperature fell below 10 degrees overnight. In the days that followed, rescue efforts stretched across the region, including flights by a pioneering local pilot who flew low over the flooded, frozen landscape searching for survivors and dropping emergency supplies to those still stranded. When the full toll was finally counted, the Armistice Day Blizzard had killed somewhere between 145 and 160 people across half a dozen states, a significant number of them experienced outdoorsmen who had simply never imagined that a warm November morning could turn into a killer by early afternoon. In Minnesota alone, roughly half of the storm's victims were duck hunters caught unprepared on the water. The disaster permanently reshaped how the region approached weather forecasting, contributing directly to the decision to move local forecasting responsibilities away from a distant office hundreds of miles from the storms it was trying to predict, and into the hands of meteorologists working much closer to the ground they were trying to protect. 4 storms. Nearly a century apart from one another. A wagon train buried alive in the mountains of California. Schoolchildren caught between a warm morning and a merciless afternoon on the open prairie. A modern American metropolis brought to its knees by a blizzard nobody saw coming. And a peaceful day of duck hunting turned into a fight for survival against a storm that behaved like nothing anyone in that region had ever witnessed before. Different decades. Different landscapes. Different circumstances entirely. And yet each one carries the same quiet, unsettling lesson, that winter in America has never simply been a season to be endured. At its most extreme, it has been an adversary capable of erasing the difference between an ordinary morning and a final one, often with almost no warning at all. The families who dug graves in the Sierra snow, the teachers who tied children together with ropes so none of them would be lost, the New Yorkers who vanished beneath drifts on their own city streets, and the hunters who burned their decoys for one more hour of warmth, all of them remind us of something modern life tends to let us forget. That for all our forecasts, all our satellites, all our warnings sent straight to our phones, nature still holds the final word. And every single one of these stories survives today for one simple reason. Somebody lived to tell it. If you had been out on the prairie that January afternoon in 1888, or trapped in the snow with the Donner Party, or caught on that river with the ducks pouring in overhead in 1940, what do you think you would have done differently, and do you honestly believe it would have saved you?